If you will, go ahead and turn over to Psalms 127. Psalm 127. You may wonder how I oftentimes get my subjects. A lot of times they are simply sent to me via text or in some way I'm contacted, and that's the case this week. As a matter of fact, that'll be the case for next week. It was, I think, suggested a day or two after this one was. And the topic that was suggested was that I would spend a little bit of time talking about honoring father and mother. Now, we started off in Genesis 2, verses 21 through 25. We do see the very first husband and bride, and thus we see the first family. And so I began to think about a little bit of how to address honoring father and mother. And then as I began to think about it a little more, I thought, well, one of the things we maybe should do is also at the same time talk about honoring our children. And the way we do that is by looking at the responsibilities for each of those. So if you will, follow along with me in Psalm 127, 3 through 5. Psalm 127 says, "Lo, children are an heritage of the Lord, and the fruit of the womb is his reward. As arrows are in the hand of a mighty man, so are children of the youth. Happy is the man that hath his quiver full of them. They shall not be ashamed, but they shall speak with the enemies in the gate." Well, one of the things we're going to start off doing is addressing children. The topic is actually called What Parents and Children Should Know. And we'll start off by asking this question: what do we as parents want our children to know? Well, I think one of the first things we want to start off when we begin to talk about our children is to let them know that for all of us that have children that are good, they are a blessing to us. I would say that that would describe all of the children and the young adults that we have here in this congregation. Most of us know a little bit about each other's children's, some better than others, and I don't know of any accounts where we have what we would call bad children. We have been blessed as a congregation to have a very good group of young children and young adults. I'm going to read from 3 John 4, and whenever I use a verse a little out of context, I always tell you, but I'm doing it for a purpose. In 3 John 4, John writes, "I have no greater joy than to hear that my children walk in truth." Now, in context, he is talking about Christians. He's talking about those Christians whom he has taught the gospel. That's what the context is, but certainly this is true for all of us who have children. There is nothing that gives us greater joy than to know that each of our children are walking in truth. The sad thing is there's always a flip side to the coin, right? We spent just a little bit of time just talking about how children who are good are such a blessing. The flip side of the coin is that sometimes you have children that are not blessings to their parents. Many of us, maybe we were that child when we were younger, or maybe we know some people who have children like that who are constantly causing them heartache. I'm going to go back to Deuteronomy 21. This was so serious in the Old Testament that there were heavy consequences placed both upon adults and even children for disobedience. I'm going to go to Deuteronomy 21:18. Follow along with me. I'll read down to verse 20 and then make a note or two on 21 and 22. In verse 21, starting in verse 18, it says, "If a man have a stubborn and rebellious son, which will not obey the voice of his father or the voice of his mother, and that, when they have chastened him, will not hearken unto them, then shall his father and his mother lay hold on him, and bring him out unto the elders of his city, and unto the gate of his place. And they shall say unto the elders of his city, This our son is stubborn and rebellious. He will not obey our voice. He is a glutton and a drunkard." And he then goes on, we read in verse 21, where it says that he's going to be stoned. And that's to bring fear upon the congregation. Then in verse 22, we actually learn this doesn't just apply to children. It then talks about if there's a man who has done something worthy of death, he also should be killed. Now, people begin to read some of these Old Testament passages and they begin to say, that sounds extremely harsh to go to this type of extreme to deal with somebody who is stubborn. But here's the thing, guys. They knew back then that if this wasn't addressed, and it wasn't addressed swiftly and sometimes harshly, it was going to affect both family and society. How many of you guys would want to live in a society where people could do whatever they want, however they want, and there was nothing done for whatever it was they did, right? There was no action taken. We know what that would result in. It would result in anarchy. And so you had very swift and what some would call very harsh laws. It's interesting in the New Testament, Paul begins to discuss disobedience to parents But he actually talks about it being a trait of unbelievers there in Romans chapter 1, specifically in verse 30. But as we're going to notice, this is not to be a trait of those children raised by Christians. Follow along with me here. I am going to go over to Ephesians 6. Many of you are going to be very familiar with this. And we're going to focus on this, even though I will go to a couple of verses. But I'm going to focus on one part, because as this topic was sent over to me, there were a number of things for me to ponder on. And that certainly means that I'm going to have to spend some time addressing a phrase here in Ephesians 6:1. Let's start off by saying this. Children need to understand that they owe their parents obedience. Ephesians 6:1 says, "Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right." Actually, let me make a real quick side note here. Ephesians 6:1 was written to the church there in Ephesus. Same thing with Colossians 3:20. I'm going to read that in a minute. Those letters were read publicly to the congregations, and we see that in the congregation you have the children present. I'm saying that for anybody who's watching this, who believes or thinks that children's worship or separating children from the assembly is something that is appropriate. We see that going on all the time. Here he is directly addressing the children that would have been in the congregation. And he says you need to obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Well, what are the reasons why children ought to obey their parents? First, we learn it pleases the Lord. He says this is right in Ephesians 6:1. He says the same thing really in Colossians 3:20. Children, again, Paul's addressing those children in the assembly. They're there to be learning from us, and we'll address this in a later point. We who are mature in the faith are to teach those who are not yet mature. He says, children, obey your parents in all things, for this is well-pleasing unto the Lord. The idea of saying, for this is right, for saying this is well-pleasing unto the Lord, he's simply saying you need to obey your parents because this is the Lord's will. Now, the question that was sent to me partially was, that's easy to do when you have parents who are faithful Christians. What about when parents are not faithful Christians? Or what if they were to tell you to do something that you should not be doing? Well, let's spend just a few minutes then talking about the extent of obedience. And I will say this, we'll address a passage that a lot of people do not understand. Addressing it this way should help fix that. There is an extent for matters of obedience. I would break those down into two different areas. We would say first that there are non-doctrinal matters that parents would inform their children of. Let me give you an example. How many of you guys remember when you were a kid fighting with your parents over the appropriate bedtime? Is it 8 o'clock? Is it 9 o'clock? Is it 10 o'clock? That is a non-doctrinal matter. That is something that is left up to the parent. I'm sure they have a good reason for whatever time it is they're telling you to go to bed, most likely because they want you to have enough sleep, they want you to be healthy. But these are matters of parent discretion. They don't have anything to do with doctrine. And I remember as a child, sometimes I would disagree with my father. And the rule was simply this. My dad said, anytime you disagree with something, you're always allowed one opportunity to voice your opinion on the matter. And then I'll either change my opinion or I will not change my opinion. But once you've had that one opportunity, you'll then obey. And that's simply how it worked out, even on matters of simply parental or parental discretion. So there are non-doctrinal matters, but then there are doctrinal matters. Let me give you I'll give you an example here. I'm sure that we at some time were told as children that we ought not to steal, right? Don't go steal from your neighbor. Guys, that's a doctrinal matter. You can go over to Ephesians 4:28. I'm not going to read it, but we learned that Christians are not to steal. And we also teach our children that, right? This is a matter of Bible doctrine. We simply obey it because it is biblical doctrine. But the question was given to this. What if you don't have good parents? What if your parents are not faithful Christians? What if they did tell you to do something that was not acceptable, right? We tell our children, we teach them at a very early age, it's not acceptable to steal. Well, what if you had a parent that told you it was acceptable to steal? Go back to Ephesians 6:1. And we're going to explain this here so that you understand that it applies not only to children, but that it applies also to adults in all matters. Notice where he says this, children, obey your parents, notice this, in the Lord, for this is right. All right, so there is a limitation to a child's obedience. They are told to obey their parents in the Lord. Now, a lot of people would hear that phrase and they don't understand what that phrase even means. That phrase there, in the Lord, simply means according to God's laws. There are a number of scriptures in the New Testament that actually use this phrase, in the Lord. We just looked at Ephesians 6:1, children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. We could go over to Colossians 3:18, again a passage probably most of you are familiar with. Wives, submit to your own husbands as is fitting in the Lord. Now these are two very clear passages where Paul uses the phrase, in the Lord, to refer to obeying God's will. Okay? He is not telling children to only obey their parents if their parents are Christians. He's telling children they need to obey their parents because that is God's will. We could go to Colossians and we notice the same thing. There in Colossians 3, it's the same for the wives. Paul's not telling the wives there that they need to submit to their Christian husbands just because they're Christians. He's telling wives they need to submit to their husbands because that's the will of God. Let me give you another phrase, and I'm not actually going to spend much time on it, but this is a phrase or actually a passage that a lot of people struggle with. They don't get it. It's interesting, when you go over to 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 39, we see that widows are told to marry in the Lord. There's that phrase again, in the Lord. Now, it's interesting that people will sit and complain and argue about this topic, but guys, this is very simple. In context, he is talking about widows. He tells them they are to marry in the Lord. But here's what's even more interesting. We have an understanding that all females, all males are to marry in the Lord. It doesn't actually say that, but what we understand is if you go over to 2 Corinthians 6:14, is that we're not to be, that's not in your notes, we're not to be unequally yoked to unbelievers. And so if I'm going to marry in the Lord, just as this widow who's going to remarry, I need to do it according to God's will. And so when you begin to talk about children who maybe are told to do something that is not in alignment with the Scriptures, they are to obey in his according to His will, in the Lord. It's not really that complicated. We could break it down just a little bit more simple by saying this. The law of God oftentimes does not line up with the teaching of some parents. It may not line up with the teaching of some spouses. It certainly does not line up with many of the things taught by society or the laws given in society. But in all cases, we would go back to the words of Peter, and people would say, I'm using this out of context, but I'm not. Then Peter, Acts 5:29, then Peter and the other apostles answered and said, we ought to obey God rather than men. Here's the point for children, for parents, for spouses. We're to do everything in the Lord, which means by His word or according to His will. And that is the same way that children are to obey. I'd say many of us are probably aware or have seen even on TV where children were told to do things by parents that were certainly wrong. And I'm sure that even takes place occasionally within the families of those who would claim to be Christians. Then the question comes up, okay, well, it's pretty clear to me that children are to obey their parents, specifically when what the parents are telling them to do is in alignment with the Scriptures. But how long exactly are they to be under their parents' authority? That's a question that many of you have probably wondered about. Well, as you begin to go back and look, you're going to find that there isn't any type of a specific age that is given. There's simply some principles that have been given to us. It's much like, I don't remember how long ago it was when I talked about the age of accountability. There is no specific age of accountability. There's a number of things that go into that understanding of when someone's accountable or not. And the same thing goes when we begin to talk about children under a parent's authority. We use this word child in two different senses. Sometimes we use the word to simply mean it is a child that is under somebody's guardianship or their care or their protection. Sometimes we use it simply to refer to somebody's offspring. I'm my father's child, but I no longer live in my father's house. And so we use this word in a couple of different ways. And people say, well, how long are children to be under their parents' authority? Well, they are to be under their parents' authority until they are of age. And you may say, of age of what? What exactly are you talking about? Go on over to John chapter 9. Being under the parents' authority until they are of age means they are going to be under their parents' authority until they are capable of leaving their father's house and being on their own. And that's going to vary to some degree based on when that child moves out and a number of other issues. So we'll look at an example here. This is actually one of my favorite accounts, and I wish we could address the whole account here. This is the account where Jesus goes and He heals this man who was blind from birth. Starting in verse 10 of John 9. Notice what we find here. It says, "Therefore said they unto him, How were thine eyes opened? He answered and said, A man that is called Jesus made clay, and anointed mine eyes. And he said unto me, Go to the pool of Siloam and wash. And I went and washed, and I received sight. Then said they unto him, Where is he? He said, I know not. They brought to the Pharisees him that aforetime was blind, and it was the Sabbath day when Jesus made the clay and opened his eyes. Then again the Pharisees also asked him how he had received his sight. He said unto them, He put clay upon mine eyes, and I washed, and do see. Therefore said some of the Pharisees, This man is not of God, because he keepeth not the Sabbath day. Others said, How can a man that is a sinner do such miracles? And there was a division among them. They say unto the blind man again, What sayest thou of him, that he hath opened thine eyes? He said, He is a prophet. But the Jews did not believe concerning him that he had been blind, and received his sight, until they called the parents of him that had received his sight. And they asked them, saying, Is this your son, whom ye say was born blind? How then doth he now see? His parents answered them and said, We know that this is our son, and that he was born blind. But by what means he now seeth we know not, or who hath opened his eyes we know not. He is of age, ask him. He shall speak for himself." I know I read just an awful lot there, but we ought to get the understanding here as we read this passage. There comes a point where a person is no longer under the authority of the parent. There's a point at which they leave their father's house and they go out on their own. While they're in the house, they live by the rules of the one leading the house. And yet there will be a time, though, that they are of age and they're going to be under their own authority. And let me address this before I really begin to move on. This relationship is sometimes carried over to others that a father and mother have living in a house that are not actually even their own children. We live in a time where we have extended families quite often. We have grandparents raising children. We have parents raising nieces and nephews. Oftentimes there is extended family. Sometimes there are children that move into a house who have no blood relation whatsoever to the people who are raising them, but they call that place home and they've become family. And literally that's what they're thought of. And so we begin to get this understanding that there is a guiding principle that any child who comes in and sets their feet daily under a table of someone who loves them enough to take care of them physically and emotionally and spiritually, they honor them through obedience. And children are to obey in the Lord until they are of age, but they're going to honor for always. Well, what exactly then is the purpose and the learning of obedience? Why is there such a focus on that for our children? I'm going to go back to the verse we started off with earlier. It's the verse about the mighty man, Psalm 127:4, where it says, As arrows are in the hand of a mighty man, so are children of the youth. Now, certainly a mighty man, we're talking about a man of valor here. He is excited and happy when he has lots of arrows. But another thing we know about the mighty man who uses the arrow, that arrow has to be guided. And that is true for both adults and for children. Go on over to Hebrews chapter 12. That guiding takes place through what we would call chastening. Now, many think we simply use this word only for children. We use this word quite a bit, as a matter of fact. The word chasten means to train up, or to educate, or to discipline, or to instruct. It's used regarding adults, and it is used regarding those who are considered younger or children. Hebrews 12, 5 through 11. Let's notice this chastening for those who are grown. The Hebrews writer says, And ye have forgotten the exhortation which speaketh unto you as unto children. My son, despise not thou the chastening of the Lord, nor faint when thou art rebuked of him. For whom the Lord loveth, he chasteneth, and scourgeth every son whom he receiveth. If ye endure chastening, God dealeth with you as with sons. For what son is he whom the Father chasteneth not? But if ye be without chastisement, whereof all are partakers, then are ye bastards, and not sons. Furthermore, we have had fathers of our flesh which corrected us, and we gave them reverence. Shall we not much rather be in subjection unto the Father of spirits and live? For they verily for a few days chastened us after their own pleasure, but he for our profit, that we might be partakers of his holiness. Now no chastening for the present seemeth to be joyous, but grievous. Nevertheless afterward it yieldeth the peaceable fruit of righteousness unto them which are exercised thereby. Adults need chastisement. We need to be chastened. We learn from that, and it seems like it's horrible at the time, but there's a purpose behind that. And the same is true with our children. And the Proverbs writer spends a little bit of time talking about this. I'm going to go to Proverbs 23, and then we'll go to Proverbs 13 and 29. Proverbs 23, verse 13, I'll read into 14. He says, "Withhold not correction from the child." Let me pause for 1 second. We oftentimes will correct children, just as we will with adults. And that happens in a number of ways. Usually it starts off, most of you can recall that when you were being chastened or corrected by your parents, usually it started off with them talking to you in some regard. And oftentimes an escalation in voice, and sometimes it would even escalate further than that. But he says, "Withhold not correction from the child, for if thou beatest him with the rod, he shall not die." Let me pause again. A lot of people think, how can the Bible teach that people are to beat their children? That word there where it says beat literally can be translated as either to lightly strike or to strike harshly. Let me tell you this. When I was a youngster, I got struck quite a few times. And sometimes it was much harder than other times. Sometimes it was simply a swat on the backside as I came by. When I caught my sister's bed on fire with her sleeping in it, that was a very hard spanking. All right? And we're going to learn there's a purpose behind this. He says, "For if thou beatest him with the rod, he shall not die." Remember screaming like you were dying? It's killing me, right? He says, "Thou shalt beat him with the rod and shalt deliver his soul from hell." My parents weren't trying to kill me. That wasn't the goal behind me getting spanked. The purpose was they were trying to save my soul from sin, or at least from causing damage or hurting somebody else. Proverbs 13:24. "He that spareth his rod hateth his son." Let me pause for a second. I'm going to address this later when we're addressing what the kids want us to know as parents. There are people who don't discipline their children. You guys have probably seen that take place. They run amok, they do whatever they want, and nobody does anything about it. Here, by inspiration, it says, "He that spareth his rod hateth his son, but he that loveth him chasteneth him betimes." That word betimes means quickly and without haste, right? You let them know right away. There were a lot of times as a child where I did something that was just completely dumb or ignorant, and my father was on my case right away, sometimes because I was going to hurt myself if I wasn't told, right? Right away, you need to let them know. Proverbs 29:15. "The rod and reproof give wisdom." Let me pause there. When I set my sister's bed on fire with her sleeping in it and I got beat, I got a little bit of wisdom that day. I learned that that was not acceptable, and I learned the consequences of what happens when you make bad decisions, right? I gained some wisdom. He goes on, "But a child left to himself bringeth his mother to shame." Guys, we're seeing this take place all the time by the simple fact that a lot of fathers and mothers are no longer in the house, and children literally are raising themselves, and you guys know oftentimes when you were left to your own devices, you begin to get into trouble. You begin to bring shame to your parents, and that oftentimes happens. Children also owe their parents honor. Ephesians 6:2. "Honor thy father and mother, which is the first commandment with promise." We honor them for who they are. We honor them for their position as mother or as father. We do this by speaking about them respectfully. We do this by speaking to them and about them respectfully. We show them dignity. But we honor them because of what they've done for us. And we respect our parents even if they're not Christians. Many of you might be in my situation where my parents are not Christians. But you still have to be respectful to them. And here's the thing, guys. They brought us into the world. How many of you guys have heard a child say, "Yeah, well, I didn't ask you to bring me into the world." But the thing is, we did. And because we brought you into the world, we then have brought you up, and we've cared for you and nurtured you until you can take care of yourself. And so because of that, you owe your parents respect and you honor them because of what it is they have done for you. Now, guys, here's the thing. Eventually, the tables are going to turn. We care for you right now, but there's going to be a day when you're going to probably have to care for us. And that means that you might have to care for us physically. You might have to do some things that don't appear to be very nice, right? We didn't think that was nice when we had to wipe your bottoms as little babies. But the tables are going to turn one day. It also may mean that we have to actually be cared for financially. I don't think any parent wants to be a burden on any of their children. And yet it could get to that point where we don't have a way to provide or we can't buy our medicine. I'm going to go over to Matthew 15. I'm going to notice verses 4 through 6. And I wish I could spend a little more time on this. We've addressed this a little bit before. But what you have here is the Jews defrauding their parents. Matthew 15, starting in verse 4. For God commanded, saying, Honor thy father and mother, and he that curseth father or mother, let him die the death. But ye say, Whosoever shall say to his father or his mother, It is a gift by whatsoever thou mightest be profited by me, and honor not his father or his mother, he shall be free. Thus have ye made the commandment of God of none effect by your tradition. Now, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that, but what you had happening was the Jews would go give money to the temple there, and they'd work out a deal where they would get that money back after their parents died, but their parents would come and say, I need you to help take care of me financially. And they'd say, well, I gave all my money to the temple. It was a gift. And then they would defraud their parents, and then it had been worked out that they'd get money back, right? Jesus' point was there were some Jews who literally were out defrauding their parents who needed them to take care of them, and we actually find that there were Christians who were doing the same thing. And that's why the early church needed to have this command in 1 Timothy 5:3. Honor widows that are widows indeed. Now, we've discussed widows indeed, and we've talked about the qualifications for widows indeed. Widows indeed were widows that didn't have a living spouse. They didn't have any family children to support them. And we get the understanding that the church doesn't have the finances to support every single widow out there who has family members, but they refuse to take care of their parents. But the church would be the last resort and the only one who could take care of, most likely, these widows indeed. And the reason is because the families were supposed to take care of their parents, specifically children. 1 Timothy 5:8 says, But if any provide not for his own, and especially those of his own house, he hath denied the faith and is worse than an infidel. Now, it's sad that in the New Testament you even have to address something like that. But families were responsible for taking care of their older parents. Now, in the case that there was no one to do that and you met the qualification as a widow indeed, then the church would be able to help with that. But there are a number of things that our children owe us. And as I began to work on this sermon, that's the easy part. That was the easy part for me to address this, really the things that children need to do for their parents. But then I thought, why don't we point the finger the other way? Why don't we not just tell what's expected of the children, but let's also talk for a few seconds about what's expected of us as parents. We talked about what parents want their children to know, but what do our children want us to know? Guys, this is going to help us to focus on being better parents. And yet, as I said, this is the harder part for many of us. It's easy to hear and drive on the way home telling our children, did you hear about that? You understand how you're supposed to be as children, right? But now they're going to know what they should expect of us. And again, like I said, this is the harder part as I begin to work on this. One of the things children want us to understand is that we need to keep calm and avoid anger. This one hurts a little bit for me because I'll let you know, and I've gotten much better over the years. I think my father did too. But I'm one of those who, when I'm pushed I can get aggravated. Our children, they want us to know that doesn't do any good. They want us to remain calm. They want us to avoid these situations of anger when it's possible. Proverbs 15:1 says, A soft answer turneth away wrath, but grievous words stir up anger. How many of you guys have ever come in to begin to talk to somebody and you ask a question, you didn't really have an aggressive tone, and their response back was, you could tell, full of anger? That immediately changes the conversation, doesn't it? Because your response back to them then is one filled with anger. And that's all happened probably for every one of us. And if you haven't done it, I'll raise my hand and say I have. Our children want us to understand that we need to stay calm and avoid anger. James 1:19 says, Wherefore, my beloved brethren, let every man be swift to hear, slow to speak, and slow to wrath. That's something I didn't used to do very well. It's something I'm still working on. We have to learn to control our anger as we're being examples of gentleness. 2 Timothy 2:24, I'll read down to verse 26. And the servant of the Lord must not strive, but be gentle unto all men, apt to teach, patient, in meekness instructing those that oppose themselves. Would you say that describes our children sometimes? Does it describe us sometimes? It does. If God peradventure will give them repentance to the acknowledging of the truth, and that they may recover themselves out of the snare of the devil, who are taken captive by him at his will. There are a lot of people who have been raised in households where anger is just what was demonstrated and taught for them. Sometimes it's not even anger. There are some houses where people literally are not angry, but they seem angry because they're loud houses. How many of you guys have been to a loud house? Just because it's a loud house doesn't mean it's angry, but sometimes it's portrayed that way or it comes across that way. And so many of the things we saw modeled for us, we unfortunately begin to do ourselves, and we model it for our children. Uncontrolled anger provokes anger. Ephesians 6:4, and ye fathers, provoke not your children to wrath, but bring them up in the nurture and admonition of the Lord. Our children want us to know that they want us to be calm and to not get angry. Now, some are going to hear this next point, and the children are going to say, I don't think this is true. Our children literally do want us to show them that we love them through discipline. And some say, no, I don't think so. Guys, I began to go back and look at some studies, and it really made me even think about some of the counseling classes that I took when I was taking my master's degree. It has been proven that children who are raised without parental correction or guidance, they resent their parents. Oftentimes they resent their parents really for not being involved in their life at all. And as I was going through the scriptures, that's exactly what we learned in Proverbs 13:24. Loving our children is seen through discipline. Neglecting our children has been proven to cause them to be resentful. And so we get this understanding that at the time it seems horrible, but for those children who are raised with no one who loves them enough to correct them, studies have shown that they oftentimes are raised resentful of the fact that their parents didn't love them enough to lead them down this correct path. And so we have to chasten our children while there's still time. Proverbs 19:18, chasten thy son while there is hope, and let not thy soul spare for his crying. I bet there's a lot of people in prison who were raised without parents, or at least with unloving parents, who never corrected them, who now looking back, although they're responsible for everything they do, don't take me wrong, but who now are looking back and saying, why is it my parents didn't love me enough to correct me, that allowed me to lead myself down this path? One of the things we understand is children who rule the home rarely accept any rules outside the home. That is seen in our current society in the way that not only children but adults are dealing with those in positions of authority. And guys, that is another reason why we are seeing erroneous doctrine. Some call it liberalism. I'll just call it erroneous doctrine. That is the reason sometimes much of that is infiltrating and coming into the church. They never learned respect for authority in the home, and thus they have no respect for authority pertaining to spiritual things. Our children also want us to model maturity for them. Our children need to be taught how it is to be a mature Christian. Notice in 1 Timothy 4:12, Timothy is told, let no man despise thy youth, but be thou an example of the believers in word, in conversation, that word means manner of life, in charity or love, in spirit, in faith, in purity. The younger people want us to model, they need us to model pure Christianity for them so that they can actually see the correct things being carried out in front of their eyes so that they know then how also to behave. The idea that we find taught in our scriptures is that the mature teach the immature. I'm going to go over to Titus chapter 2, verse 3. I'll read down to verse 5. It says, the aged women likewise, that they be in behavior as becometh holiness, not false accusers, not given to much wine, teachers of good things, that they may teach the young women to be sober, to love their husbands. Let me pause. We're not talking about the physical, intimate part of loving a husband. That comes naturally. They need to understand how to love their husbands in all the other ways expected of a wife. It says to love their children. We love our children from the very second they're born, but we actually need to know how to love our children. To be discreet, chaste, keepers at home, good, obedient to their own husbands. Notice this, that the word of God be not blasphemed. Remember we were talking about doing everything according to the will of God, and that children were to obey in the Lord. It's the same idea there when it talks about that the word of God be not blasphemed. They need to know how to do everything in the Lord or according to His will. And the best way for that to ever take place is for it to be modeled by those mature in the faith, by those who are not mature in the faith. Another thing our children want and need for us to do is to reassure them of their worthiness. They need to know that God loves them. Well, guys, we live in a time where people want to put everyone down. They want people to think that they are unworthy, that they're not valuable. Listen to John 3:16 and 17, and remember, Jesus was thinking about every single one of us. For God so loved the world that He gave His only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth in Him should not perish, but have everlasting life. For God sent not His Son into the world to condemn the world, but that the world through Him might be saved. If there was only one person ever on this earth, Jesus would have done that. So Jesus died for every single one of us. Why? Because our souls are worthy. We individually are worthy, and God loves us. They need to be reassured that God made them. Guys, we live in a humanist society where they want our children to literally believe that they came from some type of a blob of goo. And guys, when you're raised believing that type of nonsense, it is very easy to try to tell someone it's nothing more than a blob of goo, and if you want to get rid of it, you can get rid of it. It's also very easy to not think that you are a person of worth or of value or of beauty because you've been simply taught that you are nothing more than a bunch of skin cells that happened by happenstance. Our children need to be told all the time that they are worthy and that God made them. Psalm 139, 13 and 14, For thou hast possessed my reins, thou hast covered me in my mother's womb. I will praise thee, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Marvelous are thy works, and that my soul knoweth right well. This teaches them that they are simply and wonderfully made, just as they are. And guys, we really have to fight hard against the society that we live in and all of the false values regarding worthiness that are set by the world. Finally, we'll look at one more before I draw to a close. Our children want us to be honest with them. How many of you guys ever heard someone say, well, I just told them a little white lie and it was for their own good? Our children need to understand that lying and dishonesty is condemned and it destroys all relationships, especially relationships within the family and for children. Colossians 3:9 says, Lie not one to another, seeing that ye have put off the old man with his deeds. Christians don't lie. And one of the things that needs to take place for our children is that they're raised in an environment where they know if they come to mom and dad are not going to lie to them. They're going to give them the truth, at least within their ability to understand. So I have to say that. We are honest with our children, knowing that at all times we never place adult burdens on children. There are things that children sometimes cannot understand. They will come and they will ask a question, and because maybe they can't comprehend or they're not ready to understand, there's a lot of topics out there that would cover in that. You answer them honestly as best as you can and say, the rest of that I'm going to have to explain it at a different time. Right? But we give them the truth as best as we're able, knowing we never place adult burdens on children. There are a lot of things if I was struggling with as an adult that I'm not going to go tell my children about it. Because they're not in a position where they need to, one, worry about it, or two, they may not even be able to comprehend what's going on. They also need to understand that hypocrisy is condemned. I'm going to read Matthew 23:33 just to get my point across. Jesus says, Woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you pay tithe of mint and anise and cumin, and have omitted the weightier matters of the law, judgment, mercy, and faith. These ought ye to have done, and not to leave the other undone. Jesus says they're a bunch of hypocrites. All of the matters of the law were equally important, and all of them were equally binding, but they did some, but they didn't do others. What do you think it does to a parent's respectability when they go around telling everyone that they're Christians, but there's certain things that they do and don't do? Can you imagine a Christian parent maybe bringing something home from, bringing home the really nice ballpoint pens from work, maybe something bigger than that, you claim to be a Christian and you tell your children to live one way, and then the very thing you tell them not to do, you're out doing. You're a hypocrite. Our children need to be raised by parents who are honest with them, but also condemn hypocrisy by showing them that they're going to do all things honest in the sight of God. Why do we need to do all of these things, and why do we as parents need to understand it? Lying and dishonest and hypocritical parents oftentimes are going to raise children who are just like them. There's a song I oftentimes will think about. Was it Cats in the Cradle? I don't know if you guys know that song, but guys, our children oftentimes are going to be exactly what we were to them. And I'll say for most of us, we don't want our children to be or to do some of the things that we did. Let me sum it up by saying this. Children will never be able to totally repay their parents. When they're under their roof, the best thing they can do is to obey them and to honor them, but they will always obey them or always honor them when they are even out of the house. And for us as parents, we don't get a do-over. And so as parents, as we try to raise them in the Lord, we have to learn where our own deficiencies are as we try to go back and to correct those. I hope we've gotten a little bit of an understanding. I could have spent a lot more time on this as we've asked the questions. What do parents want their children to know, and what do our children want us to know? As I draw this to a close, my concern is for anyone watching this who is not a Christian. I won't cite the verses or by memory. I'll just give them to you. If you're watching this online, you've never really had someone spend time with you talking about how to become a Christian. It's not complicated. I would encourage you, if you're watching this or if you're here asking the question, please go back and review all the conversion accounts. They're very easy to look up. Just go to, as my parents would call it, the Google, and type in conversion accounts and begin to read those and write down what the person did in each of those accounts. You're going to find it was very simple. They were taught the gospel, Romans 10:17. That's how faith comes. They believed Jesus Christ was the Messiah, Hebrews 11:6, John 8:24, because if they didn't, they'll die in their sins. They needed to understand the consequence of sin, and they did. That's why they repented of their sins as instructed, Luke 13:3 and 5, Acts 17:30. They confessed Christ, Romans 10:9 and 10, and then they were immersed in water for the remission of their sins. Mark 16:15 and 16, Acts 2:38. Write down Romans 6:3 and 4, and 1 Peter 3:21. When they did that, they were added to the church by the Lord Himself, Acts 2, verse 47. That's what we find when you take the summation of all the conversion accounts. If you've not done that, if that sounds strange to you, I would encourage you to contact us, and I'd gladly spend time talking with you on the phone, send you studies. If you're here and you've not done that, please don't leave if you have yet to be added to the church. If you are a Christian, please go back and look at what we've talked about just a little bit. Are you, if you are still living within your parents' house, obeying your parents, being respectful, and giving them honor? And we as parents, are we living upright as examples for our children? If we're not, I would encourage you both to correct that. If there's, again, a way that we can help you in any way, you can come forward as we're led in a song of invitation.